Started here. For people who are just tuning in, thanks very much for coming and watching our Google Hangout. This is our inaugural Hangout with Sigma Xi's distinguished lecturers. We're very lucky today to have Debra Fischer of Yale University, who is an exoplanet researcher, and she's going to talk to us about that field and her own research. We're going to start out by just telling Sigma Xi members that this particular talk is being sponsored by the RTP chapter, the NC State chapter, and the UNC chapters of Sigma Xi. And if your chapter would like to get involved with one of these upcoming talks, you can talk to Sigma Xi's membership department and get your chapter lined up to do that. And also, this talk afterwards in Sigma Xi's online communities will have a thread that's set up in the lab, which is the online community that's for general discussion, where you can post follow-up questions for Dr. Fischer, and Dr. Fischer will be able to have access to those questions and answer some of them. So first of all, let me thank Dr. Debra Fischer for joining us today. It's very nice of you to give us some of your time.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Excuse me. Just to begin with, I think it would be great if you could talk about kind of what defines an exoplanet for people who don't know much about that field.
Sure. Well, an exoplanet is just a planet that orbits another star. We might also ask what a planet is, since this is something that's come under a lot of discussion in the last decade. And a planet is an object, of course, that orbits a star, like all of the 8 planets in our solar system. And it's a planet that's thought to have enough mass so that it cleared its own gap in the protoplanetary disk when it was forming. And that kind of left Pluto out of the mix, because Pluto looks like it was captured from the outer solar system by Neptune. But yeah, exoplanets are just planets that we're finding around other stars. It's sort of funny, if you Google exoplanets, then what you find is that sort of before 2009 or 2010, people were calling these extrasolar planets. And then in 2010, that name was contracted to exoplanets. And it's not a coincidence, the timing of this. What happened is that when the Kepler mission was launched and finding so many exoplanets, and they were in the news so often, that I think the media just quickly contracted this to give it a snappier name.
Right, that's interesting. I'd known the extended version of the name, but I didn't know the reason for the contraction. So it's interesting that that's why that happened. It's actually a fairly new field, though. Can you talk about when the first exoplanet was discovered and sort of when you came into that process?
Sure. Great question. When the first exoplanet was discovered, because part of the problem was that we didn't recognize what an exoplanet was when they were first being discovered. And I find this to be a really important theme or important idea, because, you know, I see this is the stage where we're at in terms of finding life elsewhere. We haven't found it yet. We won't recognize it at first, and it's going to be complicated. So I would say it's right now 2015. And this Saturday, I'm going to Haute-Provence Observatory in France, where we'll have a 20-year anniversary meeting celebrating the discovery of 51 Peg-b, a planet orbiting a star that's very much like the sun. And so that's usually the marker for astronomers, as the first planet was discovered 20 years ago. It was November 1995 when the Nature magazine article came out. And so we're approaching that anniversary now. When we look back, though, in 1992, Alex Volchan, who was at Penn State, discovered that he was looking at neutron stars that are pulsars, so they're directing their beam of light towards the Earth. And he discovered that you could measure the pulsation period, the arrival time of the pulses, very accurately. And he was able to see that the pulse times were drifting. They were getting a little longer, a little shorter, and repeating in a regular way. And with this Doppler technique of measuring the pulse arrival times around a neutron star, he discovered that there were 3 planets orbiting that neutron star. So we might say that 1992 was really the first time. And we had a hard time understanding what those objects were, because a neutron star has gone supernova. It would have blown away any planets that were there in the disk. And so these objects, which were Earth mass, had to have formed in the accretion disk around the neutron star after it blew up. So that was, in some sense, a puzzle at the time. And when I look back at that time, that moment of time now, I think, wow, we should have just realized that what that implies is that planet formation is such a robust process that it can even happen in an accretion disk around a neutron star. And then we could have just said planets are everywhere and we could have been happy and gone home. But, you know, it's been fun to actually collect the data to demonstrate that over the years. There was one other moment in time that we could peg as the first exoplanet, and that was in 1989. Dave Latham announced the discovery of a planet around HD 114762. It was a planet that was about 10 times the mass of Jupiter in a something like 80-day orbit. And at the time when he published this discovery, he called it a substellar object and wasn't sure if it was a brown dwarf or a planet, a brown dwarf being more massive than a planet. A brown dwarf can have deuterium fusion in its core. So there were these starts, right, which told us that, I think, in retrospect, that the discoveries were coming. But mostly we look at 1995 as the year that it all happened.
Right. So this actually marks the 20th anniversary.
It does, yes.
Right. Okay. And I do want to just add in, if people have questions they want to ask Deborah, there should be a spot on your screen where you can type questions, and I'll be able to ask her those questions once we get a little bit further into the broadcast. If for some reason you don't see that question panel, if you go back to the main event page, you can type in comments there and we'll receive them that way. So either way works. But when did you actually start in this field, Deborah? Sort of what stage did you come in? And you were working with some pretty famous people, as I understand it.
That's right. That's right. I was a graduate student in 1995 at UC Santa Cruz, and I started in 1997 as a postdoc working with Jeff Marcy and Paul Butler. And they confirmed the planet around 51 Peg, and then had made a couple of other, I think 3 other exoplanets had been discovered at that time. So 1997 was still a time when it was exciting news and we had no idea where the field was going to go, or would we just find a few of these really odd massive planets that are similar to Jupiter but in very short period orbits where we never expected that they would be, you know, or would there be more, and how long would the field go? So yeah, so it was a great time when it was still very early on.
Right. And you were actually involved, I think, with also one of the first discoveries of a planetary system, not just an individual planet. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that was Upsilon Andromeda. And Jeff Marcy and Paul Butler had written a paper announcing the discovery of one of these hot Jupiters, like 51 Peg, a gas giant planet that orbited in just 4.7 days. So it has to be incredibly hot at the surface of that planet. But they saw in their data the signature of a trend, which suggested an additional object in the system. And so my job as a postdoc was to try and model that, what we expected would be a 2-planet system. And the fun thing was that none of my models were working. And so when I put in what I thought should be there and subtracted it off, there was one beautiful little sine wave right in the middle between the 4-day planet and the 2.5-year planet. So it was a triple planet system. And I remember Jeff and Paul both saying, you know, this is not the way it should happen. We should find single planet systems and then double planet systems. And then a long time from now, we should start finding more complex systems. But that was just, you know, those were the cards that nature dealt us. So.
Right. Yeah. Nature doesn't always follow the script, does it?
No one told her.
But one of the things I think that's interesting about this field is it's one of those scientific fields where it really started out as almost a sort of a unbelievable field, and now it's very mainstream.
It is incredibly mainstream, right? And so in the early days, I think it was considered to be kind of fringe science, whether or not you would be able to even detect these tiny planets. And part of that, I think most of that comes from a very sordid history of exoplanets. There were announcements of exoplanet detections that go back to for planets around Barnard's star, which turned out to be wrong. There was an announcement at an American Astronomical Society meeting of a planet that was in a 180 something like that day orbit, and it turned out that it was actually the motion of the Earth, which is going around the sun, the barycentric motion, which hadn't been properly corrected for. And so when Didier Queloz and Michel Mayor made that discovery in 1995, it blew the lid off of things. And I would say, I just held a workshop on precision radial velocities at Yale this past summer in July. And Mario Perez from NASA headquarters, who spoke to us, said that, there may be a time not too far from now where exoplanets is its own division within NASA. So there may be a time when exoplanets is its own department in universities. We're seeing that the field has gotten so big and so complex that it's almost taking over as its own subfield.
Right. Yeah. Just wanted to mention to people watching, if you're looking for further reading on this topic, there was an article in May, June this year in American Scientist by Kevin Heng, who is an exoplanet researcher in Switzerland, called The Next Great Exoplanet Hunt. And it's talking about some of these upcoming observatories that will hopefully be helping in the discovery of more exoplanets and possibly more Earth-like exoplanets. So maybe, Deborah, we could talk a little bit about some of these upcoming observatories that are being launched and kind of the timescales for those and what researchers are hoping they will help you find.
Right. This is a great article, and the point is sort of that exoplanets have gone from, we're finding, hundreds to thousands, to this has become a key focus for NASA and for the European Space Agency. So NASA's incredibly successful Kepler mission followed the European Space Agency Corot mission, which found planets, but that was not the primary goal of that mission. So it was just incredibly successful. And then Kepler found, thousands of planets orbiting stars in this one particular field. And because of the success of that field, NASA's planning to launch the TESS mission, the Transiting Exoplanet Satellite Survey. The Europeans, ESA, European Space Agency, plus the Swiss astronomers are launching CHAOPS, which will look for transiting planets. And then the European Space Agency is planning to launch Plato in about 2024. So what we have now is the stage is set for a series of space missions, which will go out and look for transiting planets. And this is incredible. Now, there's one, it means that the work that I'm doing to try and develop new instrumentation to measure radial velocities is becoming more important, because the radial velocities, I'm really excited about that, that it's not obsolete. It's actually incredibly complementary to the transit observations. These missions will detect transiting planets. That tells us the size of the planet relative to the size of the star, but it doesn't give us the mass. And we really need the mass, which we get from radial velocity measurements, to tell us what the bulk density of the planet is. That helps us to understand if it's a big solid rock, or if it's a gas giant planet, or how much atmosphere it has, or whether it could have a substantial amount of water. So it really enriches the amount of information, the science that we can extract for characterizing exoplanets, to have these complementary missions, transit missions, observation, direct imaging missions, the ability to measure the masses of planets. So it's coming together. And I would say it's not just a field that's growing. It's always been growing for the last 20 years. It's a field that's booming and that looks like it's going to explode.
So let's just back up for a second there for people who aren't familiar with some of the discovery methods. I was going to get to that, but since you're talking about it, can we talk about some of the different ways that you can actually sort of indirectly see these planets? Because I don't think that there's any real direct visual measurement of them yet. It's all sort of indirect.
Okay, absolutely. So just recently, what you'd like to do is just what you said, take a direct observation, image the planet sitting next to the star. And actually, this has just happened in the last year with the Gemini Planet Imager, which has been able to look at some very bright stars, the A-type stars, and see massive Jupiters that are separated by 10 AUs. So 1 AU is 1 astronomical unit. It's a distance between the sun and the earth. So seeing stars with planets that have at large separations, that have very young, hot massive Jupiter. So this is just a field that's booming, and you'd love to do that because if you're an astronomer, it means you go to the observatory, you flip on point the telescope to your star, flip on the adaptive optics system to close the loop, and boom, there's the planet sitting next to the star. And it's true, you want to come back and follow up the observation so that you can see the planet actually orbiting, know that the planet is moving through space with its host star. So that's a very exciting technique. But most of the techniques, as you said, the techniques that have discovered the vast majority of exoplanets are indirect techniques. So that includes techniques to measure the radial velocity of the star, the transit technique, and the microlensing technique. And I can tell you a little bit about each one of those.
Right. I think it might be good to just kind of go through those for people who aren't familiar with them.
Okay. So the first technique that was used to find planets going back to 51 Peg is the Doppler technique, sometimes called the Wobble technique. And what we're doing is we're looking only at the host star. And it turns out that the host star will move towards you and away from you if there's a planet in orbit around the star. It tugs the star around a common center of mass, but we never see the planet. We just see the star itself wobbling in that orbit. That orbit has to reflect the orbit of the planet, so it has the same period. But because the star is coming towards us, we take a spectrum of the star and we see atoms in the spectrum, absorption lines, which are shifted blueward and then redward as the star is coming toward us or going away from us. We map out that change in the velocity of the star over time, and measuring the velocity change, you end up with something that's periodic, and you can then deduce from that velocity change, from that data, you can deduce the presence of a planet that you never see. And so that technique has been really successful. You can imagine that the larger the reflex velocity of the star, the easier it is to detect a planet with that technique. So that means that the planets are either massive, like Jupiter. We're getting better now so that they're getting down to several times the mass of the Earth, but also closer, because the closer the planet is, the stronger that gravitational tug will be on the host star.
That's where that term hot Jupiters came from, because most of the early ones they found were close in and large.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so that gave us a certain window, a certain bias in the sorts of planets that we could detect. And we knew that bias was there. We knew that we weren't going to be able to detect Earth-like planets in those early days with the radial velocity technique. But we just had no idea what the underlying population of the lower mass planets would be like. We found what we could find, and it was incomplete. And so that brings us to the next technique that I mentioned, which is the transit technique. And with the transit technique, you're looking at the brightness of the star. And for people who saw the lunar eclipse on Sunday night, that the brightness of the star can dim if a planet goes in front of it. So for the lunar eclipse, the planet was the Earth, and the Earth cast a shadow on the moon when we were watching. With transiting planets, they also block out some of the starlight, and so we see the starlight dim ever so slightly, really, as the planet goes across, and it takes a few hours to transit. So we in the beginning,
Excuse me.
we're still large planets like Jupiter or like Saturn. And then when Kepler was launched and was launched into an Earth trailing orbit, so it's way above the Earth's out of the Earth's atmosphere, it has a clear view of the star field. Then Kepler began uncovering thousands of planets, and many of the planets, in fact, most of the planets were small planets, rocky planets. We then learned that the planets we detected with the radial velocity technique were rare. The Jupiters, hot Jupiters, and Saturns were very uncommon. So Kepler told us that most stars have planets and that most of the planets are small rocky planets. We went from a complete paradigm shift from thinking that maybe our sun is unusual in having planets. That's what we thought before 1995, to now knowing, because we have data, that almost all stars form with planets. And that's been a stunning change. And the third technique that I mentioned is called microlensing. And the idea here is that you're at the telescope looking at bright stars that are far away, they're in the background. We call those the source stars, they're the source of the brightness. And then because all the stars in the galaxy are moving, we have a star which may have a planet, and it crosses between our line of sight to that background star. Now, you might think that, like a transit or an eclipse, that intervening star would block out the light of the background star. But in fact, it brightens the light of the background star because those light waves, which would have left the star and never come to us, now get bent around and focused at the Earth. And so we're able to see microlensing events from the lensing star, and if it has planets, from the planets that it hosts.
But is
So
that a gravitational effect, the reason why the light bends around the star?
absolutely, absolutely, because the mass of the star and the planet bend space-time. And so it bends, the photon is always traveling in a straight path, but
Hmm.
its path is now bent towards us. So
Great.
I think just intellectually, it's the coolest technique ever. It's just so amazing that mass does that, and really makes us wonder, about our understanding of gravity and, yeah. So
Right,
those,
yeah.
yeah, main techniques that have been used to find planets.
Hmm. How many have you actually helped to find at this point? Do you have a running tally?
I don't really keep notches in my belt. I know the answer is hundreds, and in the beginning I would keep count, when it's like a few and then tens, and then it got to some point where I really stopped counting. Part of it is that this is a collaboration, so I've collaborated on a lot of the papers about Kepler detected transiting planets, and yeah, it's kind of hard to sort them out when it's not one person writing one paper about one planet.
Right, of course. So, is there a limit to the distance at which you can find exoplanets at this point?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So let's pretend like the Milky Way galaxy is the size of a paper plate. All of the techniques that I described, including Kepler, are looking at a little tiny spot on that whole paper plate, that a little bubble around the solar system. So we're finding planets out to about 1,000 light years, right? The distance that light travels in 1 year, so out to about 1,000 of those distances. But the Milky Way galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So we're finding planets in our galaxy, and they're around stars that are relatively close. We're limited by the signal that we get, and that's always going to be more favorable for the stars that are closest.
Hmm. So, are the techniques that you're using now, you were talking about maybe getting to some direct imaging, but even with the indirect imaging, can you determine more than just the existence of the exoplanet? Can you discover any kind of properties of them, whether they have atmospheres, any kind of properties of those atmospheres, and what might be, the chemical makeup of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most amazing plots, figures that I remember seeing, we discovered we discovered in 2003 a planet orbiting a star called HD 149026. Not a very interesting name, but my friend Greg Laughlin put together a figure which showed, let's take a cross section of Jupiter, which has a small core, and then a massive envelope over that, and then another light gaseous atmosphere. And let's compare that to HD 149026b. And there he showed the core, the three sort of layers. So the first thing that we're getting is, if we can measure transits, we get the size of the planets. If we can measure with radial velocities the reflex motion of the star from the planet, then we can calculate the mass of the planet. Once you have mass and radius, then you can calculate a bulk density for the planet. And you can say that the laws of physics apply everywhere, and you can come up with a model for what the interior structure of the planet should look like. So we can start to think about whether or not the planets, have the right mass and the right composition to have plate tectonics. Some of this stuff is still a stretch, but internal structure is one of the key characterizations that we get. The other thing that you mentioned is the atmosphere. So at least for the gas giant planets that transit, As they go across the star, we can look during that time, we can try and take spectra. And the great thing is that when the planets go behind the star, we can take another spectrum. So in one case, we're getting the star plus the planet atmosphere. And when the planet's behind the star, we know we're getting just the star. So we simply divide out the stellar component from that combined spectrum, and we're left with the spectrum of the planet atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
We can check to see where this, as the planet's going around in its orbit, where the planet is the hottest. And that can tell us about whether there are winds on the surface of the planet. We can look for, after the planet or before the planet even crosses our line of sight to the star, we can see whether or not there's atmosphere that's sort of trailing behind the planet, or gas that might be shepherded by the planet in an orbit in front of it. So we're figuring out what the internal structure is like, we're beginning to take the first measurements of spectra of exoplanet atmospheres. And I think these are still the early days, but we're looking forward to a time when we'll have the precision to take spectra of Earth-like planets and figure out if there's methane there, if there's oxygen there, if there's carbon dioxide, what's in the atmosphere, and whether or not what's in the atmosphere makes sense from just a point of geological equilibrium given the temperature and pressure, or whether it seems like there has to be life there that's pushing, more oxygen into the atmosphere than you would expect, or more methane.
So we had actually a question from a viewer asking if there was sort of an estimate about when those kinds of atmospheric measurements could be taken. Is one of these newer observatories going to be able to do that, or is that going to be generation after that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, okay, so first of all, we are doing this right now for gas giant planets. We're getting spectra of the exoplanets when they're gas giants. But what we really want to know, and probably what the viewer wants to know, is when do we get to do this for other rocky planets that are similar to the Earth? And I think that's not going to be done by this first wave of missions that we'll see, TESS, Cheops, and Plato. It's going to take the generation after that to actually do that. So NASA is right now soliciting proposals for designs for a giant space telescope. It might be as big as 10 to 20 meters in diameter, so larger than the biggest telescope that we have right now on the surface of the Earth. And the idea is that if that telescope is serviceable, if you can take out segments of the mirror and repolish them on the International Space Station and replace them, you could have a 100-year telescope, that can be very sensitive to tiny signals. And now if you arm that telescope with sensitive spectrometers, we're going to hope to be able to detect biosignatures.
So that is actually an interesting follow-up question, though, about the kinds of observations that are being done on Earth versus in space for exoplanets. Are there inherent differences there, or is it just a question of sensitivity?
Well, it's a lot easier to work on Earth. It's a lot easier to service your instrument if something goes wrong. And so it's a lot less expensive to work on Earth. So we always sort of cut our teeth, right? We take the first steps on Earth with instruments on Earth. And then when we think we can build instruments that are incredibly robust and can be run completely robotically, that's the time when we want to launch those missions. So that's what happened with Kepler. We knew that we could do photometry in space. It was a robust, easy process that could occur with just some software instructions. And we hopefully will get to that point with spectroscopy.
Okay. We just had another listener question about your reaction to the Fermi paradox. I didn't know if you had something you wanted to say about that.
Yeah. So Enrico Fermi is a famous Italian physicist who came down to the lab one day and just said, "Where are they?" And I can imagine his companions at lunch saying, what is he talking about? Where are they? But his thought was that if we're right, and biology is easy, and it occurs frequently, then surely there must have been, out of the billions of stars and perhaps billions of planets that we now know exist in our Milky Way galaxy, there should have been some technological civilization. So where are they? Why haven't they visited Earth? And there are a lot of resolutions to the Fermi paradox. The one that I sort of, since you asked for my reaction, that I think about is that it's hard for people to imagine the incredible distances between the stars. Even the nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, is 4 light years away. And we can imagine that if we were going to send a spacecraft that would travel at 10% the speed of light to Alpha Centauri, that means it takes it 40 years to get there. And then when it phones home, somebody's trying to phone me now. Let me just unplug my phone. Sorry. And then when we phone home, it takes 4 years for the light signal to come back to the Earth. So that's a 44-year round trip for the nearest star system. So how are we going to do that? We we jump into a spacecraft, right? And we travel to the nearest star system, and 40 years of our life goes back, right? We're going to have to have generations. Our progeny are going to be forced to adopt that as part of their life. And I'm not sure, that's a hard decision to make. So the distances are incredible, and that's the nearest star system, and that one might come up empty-handed. But most star systems are going to be, 20 light years away. So we're talking about 200 years now of travel. So the distances for light to travel are incredible. It's a time commitment that's unimaginable for carbon-based life, I think. But then there's the other issue, which is that we evolved in a particular environment, right? And it's hard for us to leave the ecological niche that we occupy right now. So there are little organisms floating around on lakes that have the acidity of battery acid. And those creatures would be very unhappy if we pulled them into our world. And likewise, we wouldn't want to jump into their world. So if we're going to leave this planet, we have to take our environment and all of the resources that we need with us. And I think that's going to be a universal truth, that it's, unless someone plants a wormhole near Saturn so that we take a shortcut, it's going to be difficult for life to travel and to hop around from star to star. And they're going to have to be incredibly motivated. The entire species is going to have to be incredibly motivated.
Right. So this kind of gets back to the needle in the haystack question about actually finding exoplanets themselves, because there's just so much distance out there. There's so much data to sort through, and that's in some ways almost a computational problem as much as a conceptual problem. I wondered if this kind of tied back with another initiative you have, which is your sort of citizen science project that you're doing, this Planet Hunters. And I wondered if you could talk about that in connection to your research.
Right. Kevin Chawinski, who's now at the ETH in Switzerland, was an Einstein Fellow at Yale when I arrived. And I remember he had started a project called Galaxy Zoo, which engaged citizen scientists around the world to look at pictures of galaxies and to try and classify them, sort them, because there were so many images to go through. And so he would always ask me when I walked down the hallway, Debra, what can we do for exoplanets? People love exoplanets. And at first, I'd say, yeah, I can't think of anything really. It's a hard problem. It's not, I can't imagine what you could outsource. And then I sent my students and postdocs to a meeting at Caltech at the Sagan Summer School, where the first Kepler data came down. And I realized that this is an endless source of light curves. There are 155,000 stars. Each star was being observed, light curves once each quarter, just an incredible amount of data. And this would be something that we could show people. So we show them light curves. We ask them to go in and see if they see any transits. And if they find transits, then we said, you'll be a co-author. And when we started the project, I thought, well, there's a small chance that it will be successful. Maybe we'll find one or two things. But the problem is that the NASA, is going to be so efficient at this. They've been preparing for this mission for years, and they're using mathematical tools, Fourier analysis, to try and pull out periodic signals. And while humans are really good at pattern recognition, they might not be able to beat the Fourier analysis. And what we learned is that the human pattern recognition contributed enormously. So people were finding things. And I remember, for example, we found several transiting planets at about 40 days. And when we went back to the Kepler team, they said they found a glitch in their software code, which was causing them to miss these particular planets. So it provided feedback for them to improve, I think, their analysis code. But we also found things that were completely unexpected, like planets around binary star systems. So these are harder to pick out, but no problem for human beings just looking at these images. Collectively, we have something like 300,000 users around the world who look at planet hunters. Planethunters.org, if people want to join and help us with the planet search, it's a great contribution. And it's as if one person has sat down for 300 years and nonstop just classified light curves, like you don't sleep, you don't eat, you don't do anything, right? It's a cumulative total of 300 years of Kepler data analysis. And we've now published hundreds of planets that were discovered by users around the world. They're co-authors on papers with us. And they've found things that were completely unexpected. So this has been a real asset, I think, and a real contribution, scientific contribution.
Well, that's great that people can actually be involved at that level. But you've got some other initiatives that you're doing too. Did you want to talk about your 100 Earths project that you're working on? Because I think that kind of gets back to this idea of trying to find more Earth-like exoplanets.
Right, right. So I remember in maybe 2005, I was at a meeting with Michelle Mayor and Jeff Marcy, and I said, how long do you think we can keep going with this, with the Doppler radial velocity measurements? We're going to find all of the gas giant planets, and then we just keep finding more of the same thing. That's not very interesting. And so about that time, around 2007, I decided that we needed to improve our instruments, and the Swiss team has been remarkably successful at this. They built the HARP spectrograph, which was the first spectrograph dedicated to finding planets. And it was very stabilized. Everything about it was designed for exoplanets. So they began finding most of the low mass planets. So the project, we've now built we're on our third spectrograph. This spectrograph will go to the Discovery Channel telescope at Lowell Observatory. It's a 4.3 meter telescope, so it's a great, perfect size really for planet hunting. Be very high resolution, very stable, and we're taking everything we've learned along the way, year after year, and putting it into this instrument to make the instrument stable, so that it will have, and I actually have no doubt that we will be able to achieve a measurement precision that's at least 10 centimeters per second, so a factor of 10 better than what we've done. It doesn't mean that we'll be able to find Earths. We're still looking at stars, which have velocities on their surface, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with those. I'm working with a statistics professor here at Yale who is amazing, Jessie Shizuski. And Jessie was listening to this problem, and she said, I know a really interesting technique. It's used when there's a crowded room and there are many voices talking. And this technique is used to pull out the individual voices. So we're calling it the Planet Whisperer code. We're doing everything we can to really try and figure out how we can get the measurement precision and the statistical techniques that we need to extract these tiny signals of Earth analogs, real Earth mass planets at Earth-like distances, so they'll have liquid water.
Somebody actually buzzed in and just said that they'd asked if you could repeat the URL for the site for the Citizen Science Project.
Yeah, thank you. It's planethunters.org.
Hunters with an S? Hunters? Yeah. Okay.
Planethunters.org, and it would be great to have people join in. And we're doing a whole lot of projects on Planet Hunters right now. Yeah.
So we've just got another question from a viewer who wanted to know if you could discuss the role of cross-disciplinary collaboration on the projects you've worked on.
Oh, that is a really great question and really important. So in this field of exoplanets, interdisciplinary collaboration has been important from the beginning. It was important in terms of improving computers so that we had the CPU power and speed that we needed to analyze the data like real time. And now it's becoming more important than ever, as we need the help of statisticians to help us figure out how to extract tiny signals. We need the help of people who study the sun and understand solar physics in great detail to help us understand what kind of signals might be in the sun, in the stars that we look at. And then we need biologists to help us, define what is life, and therefore what are the signatures of life that we might expect or try to search for. It's such an open-ended question, that having people look at this from all different angles, I think, is really helpful and interesting.
Okay, great. So one of the things that I've always wondered is, are all exoplanet researchers out there looking for alien life? Are you guys all on board with that? Or are there skeptics as well as people who are convinced it's there? I'm wondering about the spread, the spectrum.
That is a really good question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer. I can answer for myself and most of the people that I know of who work in this field. We're looking for planets because we want to find life elsewhere. We're looking at these as the platforms for life. And I think that's what drives me to try and find other planets like the Earth. It's not that life won't exist in other environments, but at least this is an environment that we think we can recognize. We think we know what to look for. um, yeah, that's a great question. I think I'd be surprised if there are many skeptics at this point. Um, Frank Drake was my professor of radio astronomy when I was in grad school, and so I, remember looking at the Drake equation in the 1990s. And at the time, there's a whole series of things. You have to have the right types of stars, and the stars have to have planets, and the planets have to be Earth-like, and life has to arise on these Earth-like planets. And you go down the whole list, to finally, once life forms, it has to persist long enough so that you can detect it. It can't just be here today and gone tomorrow, on astronomical timescales, or you won't, there's a good chance you'll miss it. And what I've seen in my career now over the last 20, 25 years is that every single one of these terms, as we get to the next level, the answer is it's more than we would expect, in terms of, the factors are bigger than I would have ever guessed. So I used to write down, what is my estimate for the Drake equation, and I would guess, well, maybe we have one other technological civilization in the Milky Way galaxy, 1 or 0. And now my guess, it's still an extrapolation, still some speculation, is that there could be 10,000 technological civilizations. Now it's just we have to get the timing right, so that they don't come and go, and we've missed them.
I wonder though, it's a bit of a dichotomy there though, between what you said before about the fact that things are so spread out.
Yes.
So it's very difficult to detect anything, even if you think it might be there.
That's exactly it. There could be 10,000 or hundreds of technological civilizations, and it doesn't mean that we would have detected them yet.
Do you think we ever will detect them? I mean, that's a question I think that some astrophysicists have asked, if we would ever conceivably be able to, if they're that far away from us.
Yeah. So I think that at least simple, single cell organisms are common. I think this is a process that is complexification that goes from simple chemistry to more complex chemistry. And then finally, that selects for life is a process that probably happens on most planets that are like the Earth, at some stage in their evolution. And so we're going to start finding the biosignatures from those organisms. And then the only question is, what does the sort of pyramid of life look like? It's a good bet that simple celled organisms at the bottom of the pyramid are most common, and that technological life at the sort of top is more rare. But how rare is it? I think we just don't know.
Right, okay. Um, just to go back to some of the instrumentation you were talking about before, and how you were saying you need to sort of make it rigorous and test it on Earth before you would consider launching it into space where it couldn't be serviced. I think you're actually working on some new instrumentation of your own. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So we're building the spectrometers that we hope will still use the radial velocity technique, because that is the technique that we need to get the masses of the planets. And then we'll put this on the Discovery Channel telescope. The commissioning is planned for summer of 2017. And then we'll see how robust that is and how well we can do. I have no doubt we're going to do better than we've ever done before. And it's just, we'll see how far down we can push it.
And where is that telescope actually going to be located?
It's at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, near Flagstaff, Arizona. Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about, I mean, you've talked about some things that have been surprising, but what do you think has been sort of the biggest surprise for you with exoplanets and some of the discoveries that you've made?
Yeah, there are probably the sort of I have three or four that come to mind immediately. So I'll just start ticking them off, and you can tell me when you're bored. I think one thing I'm really surprised at is Kepler started finding stars that had many small rocky planets that are well inside of where Mercury is in our solar system. And at first we looked at those systems and we said, wow, that's really weird. You know, and you can say that once or twice or three times. And when you get to 500, then you have to start saying, gee, maybe our solar system is really odd. And so, you know, it's possible that our solar system had those small rocky planets inside of Mercury. And Greg Laughlin, who's a professor at Santa Cruz, with Constantine Badigan, who's at Harvard, have a paper where they suggest that Jupiter and Saturn, we believe, migrated inward in our solar system almost to where Mars is, and then reversed their migration and moved back out. And that process would have forced any small rocky planets in the inner part of the solar system to have been lost. So I'm surprised at, you know, the diversity of exoplanets and what those planets are telling us about the evolution of planets in our own solar system. I'm really surprised by a system called Kepler 444. The universe came into existence 13.7 billion years ago with a big bang. Our Milky Way galaxy is about 12 billion years old. Kepler 44 is in our Milky Way galaxy. It's 11 billion years old, and it has rocky planets around it. If you had asked me 15 years ago, do I think that stars that are that old could form planets? I would have said no, because you need to have generations of stars to die and enrich the interstellar medium so that you could get the iron and the titanium and the silicon and carbon and oxygen that you need to form these planets. Yet here you go, a planet that's so old, and a star that's so old and has a planetary system. That's incredible to me. Again, means both of these things mean planet formation is incredibly robust. I've been surprised that the larger, more massive stars, which have shorter lifetimes, don't seem to have as many of the small rocky planets, but that the stars like our sun or lower in mass have many of them. They're just ubiquitous. And I've been surprised that you can have a star system where there's a binary star system, two stars that orbit each other. And you can have planets that orbit outside of that binary star orbit, that those exist. All of these things say the same thing. The same thing that Alex Volchin would have said in 1992. Planet formation is easy. It's a robust process. All you need is a little dust and gravity, and the planets seem to come together. And so I suspect that we will cross over at some point. Right now we say, gee, maybe, you know, life doesn't exist elsewhere because we've been looking for a long time and we haven't found it. There's the Fermi paradox, which tells us that, you know, where are they if they exist? And the planets were here all along, right? We didn't know about them 20 years ago, but they were there. And I think the same thing's going to happen in terms of finding biosignatures and life elsewhere. At some point, we'll wake up. The universe will look completely different to us because we will have discovered life not just on one or two or three planets, but on hundreds.
So you were talking about some of the surprising planetary systems that you found. Has there been some data coming out of the various exoplanet research that gives you a better sense of how often planets stay where they're formed versus how often they get captured or moved to other places?
Right. Well, the planets will always stay in the solar system where they're born. I think it's hard to exchange planets, not impossible, but it might be harder to exchange planets between stars. I mean, the one case exception might be these circumbinary planets, which are really bizarre. But probably in the inner, that probably most planets are moving around When the star forms out of this sort of cocoon of cold molecular gas and dust, it's collapsing, it's heating up, it's spinning, and there's a flattened pancake of a protoplanetary disk around the star. All the material drains through that disk onto the star, with the exception of some debris that's left behind, and that's where the planets form. And now we know that when those planets are forming, it's not just one or two or three or eight planets that are forming, but there are hundreds, thousands of planetesimals that are forming, and they're gravitationally interacting. They're scattering each other, they're accreting, they're falling into the star, they're getting kicked out. So that early process is a lot more active than we ever imagined.
So do you think that has implications for what I think you guys call the Goldilocks zone, in terms of the spot that seems to be not too close, not too far to the sun, to possibly have habitable planets? Does this mean that planets might not have to form there in order to become habitable?
Absolutely. Yeah. It means that they can move around. They can move, in or out. They can migrate inward. They can migrate outward as well. Probably once the disk settles down, though, the dust clears quite literally. And at that point, we think that the planets are sort of going around like clockwork. They're still slowly interacting with each other. That's true. I have my students right now will be running an in-body simulation of the solar system, and they'll plot out, the eccentricity with time, and we see that we lose in something like 3 or 4 billion years, we're likely to lose a planet from our solar system, because there's still gravitational interactions between the planets. So, but for the most part, right, they can be they're stable for millions, billions of years.
Is there a sense of, and you were saying before that maybe our solar system isn't normal, or it's weird. Is there a sense of where our solar system kind of fits into the spectrum of what is kind of normal and what's not normal for planetary systems?
Yeah, I wish that we could answer that question. And I think, we hope that we'd be able to do that by now. But the truth is, if you plot out the mass of the planets detected as a function of their orbital period, or their semi-major axis, their radius from their star, we haven't found, we found only a few planets like the Earth. And we know they must be there. We see this like tidal wave of planets coming up to that point and stopping just short of it, because they're so hard to find. So what would the signposts of our solar system be? It would certainly be small rocky planets in the inner part, and we found that around other stars. It would be big gas giant planets orbiting at great distances, like Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Neptune. And we found some of those, but we haven't been able to piece together the architectures of a particular star, so that we know from the inner part to the outer part exactly what's there. So we're still sort of trying to put together a picture, which is not unlike the old parable, right, of the men who are trying to figure out that what is the elephant, and one is holding the tail, and one is feeling the trunk, and one is, yeah, that's kind of where we stand in this game right now.
Right. Okay. So we've only got a few minutes left, so I thought maybe we could back up and talk a little bit more sort of philosophical big picture for the last few minutes we have. I wondered if you could talk about why you think it's important to study the universe. Why should we get off our planet and look at the bigger picture and see where we fit into it? Why is that important to us?
Um, Probably for some people, it's not so important, right? It's going to be a matter of your interests. For me, it's important because of the perspective that it gives us. For me, this whole exercise has taught me that our planet is just this tiny little speck, orbiting a star, which is one of billions in our galaxy, which is one of billions of galaxies in the universe. That the stuff that we're made out of is incredibly rare. And then also the time, that the idea that, the Big Bang occurred 13.7 billion years ago. Carl Sagan collapsed all this timeline onto a cosmic calendar. And if you look at that cosmic calendar, where Big Bang is January 1st and it's now December 31st, about to tick over, our Milky Way galaxy forms in May. The sun forms in August. There's microbial life crawling on the surface of our planet by September. But the dinosaurs aren't here until Christmas Eve, and they stay until December 30th. So we're just here in the last seconds of the cosmic year. So it gives me that kind of perspective too. And I think that's important for humanity to see where we fit in. If we have this, if we can find life elsewhere, my hope is, and it might be naive, is that it will unite us in some way, in some ways, and we'll see that we're really quite special and miraculous, and understand where we fit in a still broader picture.
So to you, do you feel like the study of the universe is much more of on sort of a philosophical level about trying to form connections between us as well as between the universe and sort of where we fit into it?
Yeah, there are also practical advantages, right? We can watch for near Earth asteroids, so we can. I guess I see astronomy as the vision plan for humanity. So if you're a businessman, then you have to run the day-to-day operations, but you also want to know, where's the field going? What's going to happen? What are the big opportunities? And I think astronomy does that for humanity.
Right, okay, great. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm actually going to try to wrap up here. We just got one last question I think we can take. We got one from a viewer who asks, what advice might you have for students early in college with an interest in exoplanets, what to study, read, and think about, for example?
Yeah, study everything. I mean, try and be as interdisciplinary as you can, because that's where this field is going. We're going to need people who understand chemistry and physics and astronomy, and related fields, statistics, mathematics. So all of those things, and you'll bring your special expertise if you're passionate about it. And so you might fit in ways that you can't predict right now. So mostly study what you just really love. And then lots of physics and mathematics.
Right, okay, great. Okay, so we're just about out of time, so I'm going to thank our sponsoring chapters again. It's the RTP, NC State, and UNC chapters of Sigma Xi. We hope that your members enjoyed watching and discussing, and please do come to the Sigma Xi online communities page, the lab, after this discussion to post your follow-up queries to discuss what Dr. Fischer talked about, and hopefully we can get some of those questions answered as well. But Dr. Fischer, thank you so much for your time and for coming and hanging out with us and for being one of Sigma Xi's distinguished lecturers. Just one quick announcement, our next Google Hangout with our next distinguished lecturer is going to be on October 7th, so keep an eye out for that, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming.